So we're here with Doug Chinnery in our second part of our creative landscape photography session, and we're going to be looking at some different techniques that you've been using. Do you want to tell us what those techniques are?
Yeah, sure. We've perhaps described them, or I've perhaps in the past described them as creative camera techniques, but a lot of people would say that all photography is creative, so perhaps it's maybe more accurate to describe them as maybe alternative camera techniques.
Yes.
And they're techniques which allow us to break free from some of the conventional landscape photography techniques. They help us as well break free from tripods, which is one of the things I like about.
That's not a bad thing, is it? No?
Not a bad thing at all. And so we're going to look at a couple of techniques today, particularly ICM, which is intentional camera movement, so moving the camera during the exposure.
Yes.
And then a feature which has come into some digital cameras now, which we call multiple exposure techniques, and we'll deal with that a bit later on. It's not a feature that's available in all cameras, but some digital.
This is a layering technique, isn't it? So instead of just overlaying, you can actually combine the shots in different ways.
Exactly, laying one picture on top of another. Film photographers have done it for generations by exposing the same frame of film more than once, adjusting the exposure so the picture doesn't overexpose. When they do it, they literally just lay one picture on top of another. The advantage of doing it with a digital camera, and particularly with cameras like the Canon 5D Mark III, is that Canon have built in some software which alters the way the pixels interact with each other. So the pixels start to blend, and you've got different modes you can choose, similar to the blending modes in Photoshop if you're used to those.
It's like having Photoshop in your camera.
In the layers panel, yeah. And
Brilliant.
so you can start to alter the way the pixels interact with the pixels in the frames beneath them, and that gives different effects, and we can demonstrate those as we go through.
Okay, well, do you want to start on intentional camera movement? Because I know people understand the basics of it, but I know there's also a lot of confusion about how you move the camera.
Absolutely.
And what you can do with the camera.
Sure. There's the conventional camera movement, which a lot of landscape photographers do, which is quite simple, often done on a tripod. And maybe you'll see it done at the coast, where the camera's on a tripod, but the tripod head is quite fluid.
Yeah.
Maybe at sunset or sunrise, and the camera is panned very evenly backwards and forwards with a 1 or 2 second exposure, and so you get a nice blur of colour.
But you still pick up a straight horizon.
Everything's very straight, everything's very orderly,
Yeah.
And they can be really effective, they can be very beautiful. They're all about light and colour. They look very contemporary, and beautiful when they're printed and put on the wall, fit in with modern decor and so on. There's also the styles that you see. A great subject is something like a bluebell woodland, where photographers will slightly move the camera upwards or downwards during the exposure, and you get a blur of the bluebells and maybe the tree trunks, and that's quite straightforward, very easy. You just need a sort of a 1 or 2 second exposure. Nothing very dramatic's happening, and most people would find it quite beautiful. It's quite conventional camera movement.
Out of interest, what aperture do people use when they're taking photographs like that?
In that situation, and probably with all ICM photography, the aperture is pretty irrelevant.
Okay.
We're more interested in shutter speed than anything else, so I will vary the aperture to get the shutter speed I want.
Yes. Because
we're moving the camera so much, depth of field becomes irrelevant. Focus is sort of relevant in that you can either defocus the lens purposefully to give a much more abstract look, or you can sharply focus the lens before you start moving the camera, and that will make the objects, in this case trees and so on, more defined, but because you're moving the camera quite a bit, they're going to get soft. And so you can play with focus, but depth of field is not really relevant, because you're moving the camera so much, things aren't going to be sharp in the picture.
So as long as you've got everything not completely out of focus, you're going to get some detail in the picture.
Absolutely,
to play with.
And that will vary depending on how much you move the camera during the exposure. The more you move the camera, the more abstract and the softer everything gets.
Okay.
And so aperture to me is only relevant really as regards controlling the amount of light entering the lens.
Yeah.
So if I need a slower shutter speed to get the effect I want, I will stop the lens down to f11, f16, f22, and if I need to let more light in to allow for a faster shutter speed, then I will go right down, and I'll shoot wide open if necessary. That's all I'm using the aperture.
And I notice you've got what looks like is it a 3-stop ND and a polarizer on at the moment?
So here, because it's quite bright, what's the time? It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The light is quite bright. So to control the amount of light going into the camera, the aperture's not enough. The sweet spot for me on shutter speed for ICM photography is about 1 to 5 seconds. And that is the sort of area, the zone I'm aiming for. There's no exactly correct shutter speed. You will need to find the shutter speed for the subject and the look.
And the amount of movement, I presume.
Exactly. So I'm aiming to get the shutter speed into that zone, and I will use the aperture and then filtration to get me into that zone. And then I will swap out ND filters and I will adjust the aperture until I fine-tune the shutter speed to get the look that I want. And so there's a bit of experimentation in the early part of the shoot, and then once you get the right shutter speed, then the experimentation comes down to the amount of movement and the direction of movement with the camera.
Just a final question before we get on with photographing. Lens choice. I don't suppose it matters too much. It's about framing generally.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can shoot with a very wide lens. Shoot with I'm using a 24-70 here because it's quite flexible. I can just zoom and frame the shot as I want. But equally, I would use a 70 to 200mm lens if that gave me the look that I was after. Try with a fisheye. This is a very playful technique. It encourages experimentation. So I would encourage people try using a lens baby. Do all sorts of things. It is something that you should really play with.
I would presume to begin with to use a normal lens, because if you use too long a lens, then the movements are quite hard to control. Would that
Absolutely,
be right?
Yeah. So to get started, something in the mid-range, like 24-70 fine, an 18 to 55, something like that. Perfect lens to start off with and get used to the technique. And initially, getting used to the technique is more about getting the duration of the exposure right, and the amount of movement right, than anything else. So I've got a polarizer on, and I've got a 3-stop ND filter slotted in. You don't have to use high quality filters. Don't worry about going down to f22. Diffraction is irrelevant.
Yes.
This is one of the wonderful things. You can use the cheapest, tackiest lenses you like. Buy cheap old lenses off eBay. Doesn't matter. The quality of the body really is irrelevant. If you want to use some old beat up camera, really doesn't matter. If you want to use a compact camera, it really doesn't matter. This is one of the wonderful things about it. It's open and accessible to everybody, and it allows them to create something that nobody can duplicate, and something where they can perhaps become a bit more artistic, or put maybe some different feelings, different emotions into their pictures. That's what I like about it.
Brilliant. Well, we'll move on to taking some photographs.
Okay.
Just pause there a second while I check everything's still running. Give me a quick sound check again.
1, 2, 3, 4.
That's fine. And that's fine. And that's fine. Okay.
Huge SD cards in these things.
16 gig in both of them.
And how long will that give you?
I think it gives you about 2 hours, about 1 3/4 on these. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah. So you'd basically just run them until they're dead. I've got another couple of 16s in there. They'll keep me going for a while.
Okay.
Okay. So we're here in Clumber Park, and we've got some wonderful autumnal conditions. It's a bit of a late autumn, but it's good for us. So if you want to introduce us to the ICM technique, is that right?
Okay. So I'll just talk you through how I've got the camera set up. As I explained before, it's all about shutter speed and camera movement. So I've got the camera set to ISO 100, gives me a nice slow shutter speed, and it will give me a good quality print, not too much grain. I will have the metering set to matrix or evaluative metering. I'm not interested in histograms. When I'm doing classic landscape photography, I shoot to the right and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But this is another wonderful thing about this. I'm not quite so worried about optimizing the raw file and so on. I want to be free of all that kind of
so
thing.
possibly err on underexposure slightly.
Maybe slightly,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Don't blow the highlights. But I don't worry if shadows start to block up a bit and things like that. I'm not too sort of fanatical about that. I'd also encourage you to experiment with the white balance and really push the white balance. If you like the work of photographers like Chris Friel and people like that, Valder Bailey, you'll see quite extreme colours and quite dramatic effects, and they can often be achieved by playing with the white balance and then in software experimenting with sort of colour and so on, and you can create really dramatic effects. If that's your cup of tea, then you know, by all means do that.
So that's at the most basic, going and swapping maybe between daylight and tungsten, or actually changing the Kelvin, thousands of degrees value or whatever.
Literally, yeah. I tend not to experiment with the white balance in camera.
So you can do it.
Some photographers do.
Yeah.
That's perfectly fine. I tend to leave it on auto white balance and I play when I get back home.
Yes.
But you can certainly switch the white balance in camera if you like, and you'll start to see the results on the back of the camera. I shoot in RAW to give me a really good quality file that I can play with out in the field. And at the moment I've got the camera set to f/16 because I know that'll give me a good long shutter speed. And just taking a light meter reading now, I'm getting around about a second or so. So I'm just going to take it up to f/22, and that's giving me about 1.5 seconds. So I'm in that 1 to 5 second zone that I spoke about. So you'll notice no tripod, which is wonderful. I work in full manual as opposed to aperture priority, so that I can just keep swapping shutter speed and aperture freely. That really suits me, but you can work in aperture priority and use exposure compensation to adjust the exposure if you like. And then I'll just find something that looks interesting. So I've just got some silver birches here, some bracken in front of me, some nice grasses and things, and we've got some nice sort of a bit of a mackerel sky going on up above us, although at the moment I'll probably get rid of the sky and just home in on these trees. Because I've got a polarizer on, I will always just have a play with the polarizer and see if I can get a polarizing effect, but because the sun's more or less behind me, I'm not really getting much effect with that. And just playing with the light meter now and looking at the light meter gauge at the bottom of my screen, actually the exposure's coming out at about 3 seconds at f/22, so I'm just going to take it back down to f/16 to give me about 2.5 seconds there, and we'll just see how that comes out.
Hold on just a sec.
Yep.
Stay where you are. I'm now going to move this behind here so we can get a shot of what you're looking at. So I can then insert this in the background. I think that should be okay. Okay, just carry on.
Okay. So now I'm just going to do a very approximate focus on the scene in front of me. I'm using live view, so I've got it framed approximately how I want it. And I'm just going to experiment and just pull the camera back towards me and then have a look. And what you'll find is that almost every picture you take will be rubbish. Because this is such a random process and you've got so little control, you have to take lots of frames. And so what I tend to do often is go for a walk, take the dog for a walk, have the camera with one lens and just have my filters in my pocket. And as I walk, I'll be taking shots and experimenting, and usually nothing works. And then I'll get to a point and something will start to work, and I always talk about getting a bit of a tingle.
So this is something you'll see in the field. You'll be ready. You'll start seeing something happening on the back of the camera and going, I'm honing in on something.
Yeah, I get a bit of a flutter, a bit of a tingle.
Yeah.
Because something about the picture that I'm seeing on the back of the camera is connecting. So I'm getting an emotional response, really. That's what we're saying. And it might be to do with the colours, it might be to do with the shapes, the composition is working for me. When I get to a point in the walk where that starts to happen, I will stop where I am then.
Yeah.
And then I will start to fine-tune the image. So I will ask myself, what is it about the picture that I like? and what do I need to do now to perfect it? Because usually it'll be okay, but it won't be quite right. So I'll think, well, how did I move the camera? Well, I moved it backwards and forwards, or I moved it up and down. Maybe I need to move it a little bit less or a little bit more. Maybe the exposure needs to be a bit longer or a bit shorter. Maybe I need to move the camera and then pause for the, so say for example, I've got a 4-second exposure. I might move the camera for 2 seconds and then pause for 2 seconds.
So this isn't definitely a consistent movement all the way through. You can start to build up almost multiple layers within that 5 second.
Absolutely, yeah. You don't have to point the camera at the same thing for the whole length of the exposure. So for example, I could go, this is a 2.5 second exposure, so I could go 1 and 2 and 3 and overlay one image on top of another.
Yeah.
So in a way that's a bit like doing a multiple exposure, but on a single frame.
More organic, yeah.
So you could be on a beach and you could be pointing it at the sea, and then you could pick up a bit of cloud detail, or you could pick up a bit of shingle detail from the beach.
Yeah. And the ratio, the amount of time you're looking at those things will affect how dominant they are as well, I presume.
Exactly.
Yes.
You could do a shot along a beach, and then there could be somebody walking towards you. You could turn the camera and then pick a bit of them up, and they might become a ghostly figure walking along the beach, for example.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of things you can do. It really is limitless, the kind of effects that you can get. So that refining process, once I've got to the point where I'm starting to get interested, it might take me 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes stood on that one location then to fine tune the image. And that's where the sort of the hard work is. But what I always encourage people to do is not to go out and take 20 or 30 frames of ICM, because in all likelihood you'll have to delete them all because they'll all be rubbish.
So in many ways you could think about your initial photographs as sketches. These are the sketches that go towards the idea that then becomes a picture.
You really are experimenting, then all of a sudden one of the experiments starts to work.
Yeah.
And that's when you start to fine tune that experiment, if you like. And it all starts to come together, and you've got to look at the image and work out what is working, but what's not working, do more of what's working and less of what's not working, and pull it all together. So you're crafting an image, and that's where you really start to create the image itself.
I think that answers one of the criticisms that we heard of a few people, is it's taking them many shots. It seems a bit random, but in this way it becomes less of a random editing function, more of a honing in, more of a distilling.
Absolutely.
Towards something. So you're finding ideas and then picking and choosing ones to develop.
Absolutely. I joke and I call it wiggling the camera about, and to a certain extent it is exactly what it is, but there is a lot more to it than that. And so if I was to go out doing ICM work for say half a day, I would fully expect to take 500 frames, maybe 700 frames, and out of that I would expect to maybe keep about 10.
Out of interest, out of all those frames you'd taken, how many of those would be ones where you've gone, oh, I've got a bit of a tingle about this, I think these are going to work?
Yeah, so you might get, out of that many, there might be 60 or 70 that give you the feeling.
Yeah.
The fine tuning would then whittle it down to maybe 5 or 10.
Yeah.
And out of those, I would maybe end up showing 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of the huge disposal rate.
So if you were told in advance that you can only take 10 pictures out from the field, you'd still probably get a good hit rate, because you know which ones are working well in the field while you're out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would also say you will see a lot on the back of the camera that you think are good. When you see them on the screen at home, some of the ones that you thought were good will be disappointing.
Yeah.
They tend to look better on the back of the camera.
Is this because of a textural thing that may be developed? Yeah.
Yeah. Equally, sometimes ones that you weren't that impressed with on the back of the camera might have something about them.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are pictures within pictures with ICM, in the same way that there are with landscape pictures. Sometimes when you get the crop tool working, all of a sudden something emerges down on one side, one corner or whatever.
So don't throw any away.
I don't do much deleting in field at all, if at all. Usually I'm concentrating on shooting. If anything comes out pure black or is completely bizarre, then I'll get rid of it. But usually I leave that process to when I get home. And when you see them on the big screen, that's when you can sort of start to make your decisions as to sifting out the wheat from the chaff. Definitely.
So, out of interest, when you're wandering around, we're in a great location now, as you can see. What are the sort of things you look for in raw material? when you're wandering around? Because obviously it's very different than a pictorial
It
approach.
is, yeah. The brilliant thing about ICM is you can do it almost anywhere. You don't have to be in a magnificent landscape.
Yeah.
I've seen wonderful ICM work done in town streets, in local parks, down by canals and riversides, quite anonymous places, even industrial estates and things like that can produce really good work. You can do it when the light is not brilliant. You can do it at night. You can go into magnificent sort of classic landscape areas and do it, and it works fantastically. But often when I'm doing it, I'm literally going off, with our local ordnance survey map and walking around North Nottinghamshire.
Just have a walk.
Nottinghamshire is not noted for being the most beautiful place in England.
No.
So just a local public footpath can yield, and I'm often looking for things like, maybe a row of fence posts jutting out of a hedge, 2 or 3 trees. It could be a small building. Now, the small building itself might be quite ugly, and we wouldn't normally photograph it. But because we're distorting it and diffusing it, it just becomes a vague shape and gives the impression of a building. And it may end up looking like a beautiful cottage on a Scottish hillside, when it might be actually an old shed near Burton-on-Trent. It doesn't have to be something magnificent.
Yeah.
You'll often find that because you move the camera, what is flat becomes a hill. Shapes change, the colours change, things become what they're not, and so you can change the landscape quite significantly. You can also, with cameras like the 5D, with the multiple exposure technique, save one ICM image and then overlay another ICM image on the top. So you can start to build up layers of texture.
Oh, so the multi-exposure of ICM.
Exactly, yeah. So there's lots of experimenting to do. So you can start to create incredible landscapes from it. Yeah, you might take a photograph of a flock of birds flying, and then lay that over another scene, which is a field with some fence posts and a little hut or something.
Find some more pictures then, shall we?
Yeah, okay. So if you take, say for example, we've got a lovely silver birch tree here. Very beautiful, lovely colour. So just to sort of demonstrate the technique again, I would just very basically focus on it, and it's only a rough focus, don't have to worry at all. You can try things like holding your arm completely at arm's length and then just giving it a little wiggle. And you can get quite a painterly effect. I've just blown the sky a little bit, so I just speed the shutter up a touch, little wiggle, and you start to get a painterly effect. I find with vertical lines, it's often good to move the camera backwards or forwards towards it. If you've got something vertical and you start to move the camera from side to side, often the vertical lines start to repeat.
Yes,
personally,
okay.
I don't really like that.
Yeah.
The same with if you've got strong horizontal lines in a picture. I find if I move the camera up and down, you get stepped and repeating horizontal lines. I don't really like that.
Yeah, looking for texture rather than that sort of graphic repeating
so
hard shapes.
If I'm at the coast and I've got strong horizons and beach lines and things like that, I'll often move the camera more left and right or backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
If I've got strong vertical lines, like in a woodland or something like that, I will often move the camera up and down or backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
But sometimes you'll just have a very long exposure. So if I take the camera up to sort of f22 and I just adjust the exposure. Hold on a second. And sometimes it might just be a case of trying to hold the camera still at arm's length, but of course with a 5-second exposure you can't possibly hold the camera still, and it just adds a little bit of diffusion.
Yeah.
So it's only slightly abstract, it's almost sharp, it's just slightly off sharp. So and you quite possibly will find techniques of your own. Once you start playing, you'll find that you can do things yourself. One of the old techniques that I've seen done is where people zoom the lens during an exposure.
Yes, classic old.
Which is sort of a
Zoom
classic old sort
lens.
of effect, and you can start to get effects. So I'm just sort of zooming in and out and play about with it. Move the camera as well if you like.
Yeah.
Nothing to stop you doing anything like that, and just see what you get. But again, I would always say 9 out of 10 pictures are going to be awful. Don't take 50 and then think you're rubbish at the technique, because in all likelihood you will have to delete all 50. Go out and take 2, 3, 4, 500, and you will find some beautiful images in amongst them. I would almost guarantee it. It's well worth experimenting and really, playing with it. And I find I sort of get into a zone. The first half an hour I don't really get very much, and then I sort of really get into the flow of it, and it starts to happen.
So should we do exactly that? Should we look around for some pictures, and we'll try, and once you've found something and you've got into that zone, we'll record more about that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we've found a tingle, I think.
We found a tingle.
Fantastic. As you can see behind you, there is in front of you, there is a rather amazing birch with a fantastic beech colour in the background, and an unidentified orangey green thing on the left. Any botanical experts are out there and they'd like to identify our tree for us. So we're looking at ICM in terms of you've wandered around this area, trying various different techniques, and I saw your eyes light up as soon as you got over here. What is it you saw?
Okay, so I picked up on the structure of these two trees. There's a nice Y shape, nice strong Y shape in this silver birch here. It's got a companion spaced away, and then there's a bit of a sort of grove of silver birch off to the left, and then we've got this splash of autumn colour behind, and the foreground colour is this lovely sort of treacly purple and browny sort of shades of bracken in the front foreground here, and so I started to home in on the composition, excluding the sky, so as not to get sort of bright streaks in the shot. So just framing it so that the trees are up at the top of the frame. And what I found really worked well was using live view. I got my exposure down around 3 seconds, and I started moving the camera quite a bit, but then I found it was best to hold it still for a bit, give it a wiggle, and then pick up some of this treacly brown and purples of this bracken, these lovely rich blues and purples.
That's interesting, because photographically the colours are great of this bracken, but it's very messy, and yet it doesn't matter with what we're doing at all.
Absolutely not. And the effect that we're getting is by holding the camera still just for a second, then diffusing it with a wiggle, and then picking up a bit of the foreground colour, the trees are building up, so you're getting the definite shape of the trees, but then they're softening with the wiggle, and then by bringing the camera down over these purples and blues in the bracken, they're giving a sort of a purpley wash, and it's giving it to me it's reminding me somehow of sort of tartan colours and sort of Scottish fabrics and things like that. It's got a tapestry kind of feel to it. The colours in the beech trees behind are adding these splashes of gold and yellow to it as well, these coppery colours, and we're really getting a beautiful effect. So this is sort of ICM at its easiest, really, if I'm honest.
Yeah, you got some good subject matter in terms of colour and texture.
Very good. Yeah. I mean, often when I'm doing ICM, I'm looking for quite dull weather. I like often quite grim, dreich, wet, drizzly, foggy days. Very neutral colours, not lots of colour and so on.
Yeah.
Lots of atmosphere and bursts of light and things like that.
Yes.
So this is quite unusual for me for ICM.
Yeah.
But I suppose as an introduction to ICM, this will perhaps show the potential when you've got real beauty like this, and this will make for an excellent image, I think, to process, and it will just show what's possible with processing. This will perhaps be an image that we can use for the webinar where we do the processing techniques.
Now, what shutter speed are you using on this? About 4 seconds, is that, I presume? Or?
Okay, yeah. So I've got at the moment I'm at about 4 seconds there, but the light's changing a bit, so I'm altering the aperture as I go.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to come down a bit because that's a bit too long. I want about 2.5 seconds really. That gives me enough time. If I go too long with this scene, the trees become too blurred, and so. Are
you trying to keep that shape of the Y in the picture as well?
I really want that. That's a really nice strong shape.
Yeah.
So bit of a jiggle and then pick some purple up just as the end of the shot. There's actually quite a spindly branch coming off as well, and that's giving a nice silvery streak across the frame, which is quite nice. And so you can see I'm just moving the camera about, overlaying. That one's complete rubbish. It's picked up too much sky colour. So you haven't got to be disheartened when things go wrong. And that's beautiful, yeah. There's going to be some really nice images here. So, but even when I get one or two that I think look really promising, I keep going.
Yeah.
Don't stop, because the ones that look promising, some of them when you get back, there will be slight things wrong that just make them a bit weak.
Yeah.
And what you're really looking for is an image which is very, very strong. Wow, the light has just exploded.
I was going to say the colours seem to have increased a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go narrower on my aperture, adjust my shutter speed, because it's got brighter, but we've got real bursts of light now. And Tim is itching to get his 5x4 out of the bag.
I have no temptation to photograph at all. Honest.
Dav Thomas, his head would explode if he was here right at this moment.
Yeah, we're not going to tell Dav where it is, are we?
No, this is a secret location.
To be honest, if we said Clumber Park, it'd be hard to find anyway.
It would be very hard to
find. As I found driving in here, it's quite big.
It's pretty big, yeah. And actually, it's these blues and purples in the bracken that are really making this, I think. They're really completing the picture. So
What do you think about combining multiple shots when you post-process as well?
Possibly, yeah, I have done that. So overlaying one on top of another can give you some really interesting effects, or bringing in textures, so pre-shot textures taken on other days and so on.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned with this kind of photography, there's no rules.
Anything goes.
If I'm doing classic photography, classic landscapes and everything, then I want to preserve the integrity of the image, and I'm going for absolute accuracy and viewing it as a competition entry, if you like, where integrity is really important. With this kind of thing, I really don't mind,
It's more about a palette, I suppose.
Yeah, I would do whatever it took to get an image. In the same way that an artist, might be using oils, but then he might pick up some pastels and he might throw some watercolour at it and then take it off the stand and walk all over it. Whatever he felt he needed to do to realise his vision, he would do to get the image.
Out of interest, I know some photographers, Chris Friel is one of them, doesn't do much post-processing at all, and I'm
very little. No.
I'm told by Chris it's probably because he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Do you have any feeling about straight out of camera versus doing any post-processing? Does it matter?
If you're shooting in RAW, you're going to need to do a little bit. In all honesty, I don't spend a long time post-processing. I'm talking a few minutes, not half an hour, so it's certainly not as a long process. By fine-tuning it in camera, you're going to get it most of the way there. You're just making adjustments usually to white balance, saturation and things like that. As you'll see, we'll do things with clarity and sharpness and so on. Depending on the image, it varies from image to image. So we might look at 2 or 3 images and just show how perhaps we vary what we do, depending on the subject and what's going on in the image.
Is there any advantage of shooting JPEG instead of RAW?
And
I know in the multi-exposure you have to, but it's
no, shoot RAW. Multi-exposure is RAW.
Right.
You can shoot RAW or JPEG, whichever you prefer. No, I would recommend shooting in RAW because you've got much more latitude in how hard you can push the file, and often with ICM, because you're looking for quite extreme effects sometimes, especially if you really do want to push the boundaries.
Yes.
You want as much latitude in the file, as much dynamic range. And as much exposure control and so on. So I would shoot in RAW all the time.
And you get the flexibility in the field.
Full flexibility, you can really play to your heart's content. So feed the software with the best information you can.
Brilliant.
The best digital information.
Well, I look forward to seeing these in the post-processing
See how it comes out,
From the sounds of that, it looks like we're starting on a multi-exposure picture.
We are, yeah.
Yes.
We thought it'd be a good idea to use the same scene that we used for the ICM test shots and now show how the effect changes when you start to use multiple exposures.
Fantastic.
So I'm using a Canon 5D Mark III because this allows us to go into the multiple exposure menu. Quite a few modern cameras allow multiple exposures, but most of them don't have the blending modes of the Canons.
Is it only Canon that do that then?
At the moment that I'm aware of. I think one or two of the Nikons, like the Nikon D800, I think has got 2 blending modes, but they're fairly basic. The Canon's got 4 blending modes. One of them is a simple overlay, like shooting 2 frames of film, one on top of each other. With the Canon, you've got the 4 blending modes, and it's the average, the dark and the lights that we tend to use more than anything. And most of the cameras that will allow you to do blending just shoot 2 frames, one overlaid on top of each other. And you can do quite imaginative things with those, which is fine. But for the kind of effects that people are seeing photographers such as Valda Bailey doing, this is what she's using, a 5D Mark III, and she's using the blending modes. So as we said at the outset, each frame is laid on top of each other in the camera, and the camera is blending each pixel, and the blending mode tells the camera how each pixel should interact with the pixel below it. So there's some sort of mathematical logarithm.
Do you want to take us through what the three modes are, or the 4 modes are?
Yeah, so the basic one, if you go into the menu, the first one we've got, if I just enable it, is additive, which is the simple overlay function. So there's no interaction. It just makes the layers slightly sort of transparent, so you can see one through the other. You have to adjust the exposure, so you have to be careful not to overexpose each shot.
Okay, so it doesn't know how many you're going to take,
so
no. Presumably.
You set the number of exposures, but you have to decide on the exposure, so it's not going to assist you at all. So you have to underexpose each shot so that you don't start to blow highlights, unless you don't mind the highlights blowing. That's up to you. The next mode is average, and here the camera is going to help you with the exposure. It's going to try and compensate for any issues with exposure. So if you get bright areas laid on top of each other, it will try and pull them down for you. And that's quite a task if you've got 9 frames, which it will allow you to choose up to 9 frames. So from 2 to 9 frames. So
you don't have to tell it in advance how many? Or?
You tell it in advance.
You do, right.
So you select how many frames in advance. Don't feel that you've got to do 9 frames to get a really good effect. Sometimes 3 frames is the ideal. So but only by playing with it will you get to know what works with different scenarios. I use the average quite a bit, and it gives quite a natural look. The average doesn't mess about with the picture too much. So if you just want a slightly painterly effect, and particularly if you want to do ICM as you do multiple exposures, which you can do, so you can move the camera as you're laying multiple exposures on top of each other, additive is quite good. Just bring up the menu again. The next one down is brights, and the opposite of that is darks. And so here the camera will ignore different pixel brightnesses. So if I can get this the right way around, if you're using darks, the dark areas will overlay on top of each other and get darker and darker.
So if you took a picture of a nice scene and then took a picture of a very dark room, the whole dark room would show, because that's the darkest part of the scene.
The dark areas will overlay on top of each other. The opposite happens with the bright one. The bright one tends to ignore the dark areas, and they start to disappear, and the bright areas overlay on top of each other.
And where would you use those 2 modes?
Well, say for example, if we're in a woodland like this, you could use brights or darks, and you will get completely different effects. The darks here would tend to make the wood feel more ominous and spooky, would make maybe a more intense, moody feel.
So I presume the darks will get rid of the trees, or the white trees almost. The white trees will start to disappear.
Whereas the foliage and the bracken will become more and more intense. The opposite happens with the lights. So the sparkly foliage of things like the trees here, the silver birches and so on, that would start to really sparkle and come up. Because
every leaf would start building up.
And if you're moving the camera as well, they would start to sort of overlay over each other, and you can get quite sort of a bit like Renaissance painting, Monet kind of effects and so on. You can't change the blending modes in the middle of a sequence, so you can't do that. But what you can do is you can create a multiple exposure image, and then you can pre-select that then for the next multiple exposure image.
Oh, as a
and then
basic
overlay
background for it.
another sequence on top of it.
Yeah.
And you can keep doing that.
Oh, so you can sort of hook on the next one.
Yeah,
It's
so
like-
you could do a 9-shot dark image and then overlay on top of it
like
a
multi-tracking in the
9-shot
audio world.
light image.
Yeah.
Or you could pick a straight shot, a straight landscape, and then use that as a base image and then overlay on top of it an image taken in a totally different country if you wanted.
Yeah.
As long as it's taken on exactly the same camera.
Yeah.
And it's on the same memory card.
Yeah.
The camera has to know.
And it preserves the original pictures still.
Preserves the original. So, well, you can select that as an option. So you can either preserve all the individual images,
Yeah.
or you can choose for them to be discarded and
Okay.
just to save the final combined image.
Oh, so you can save the individuals as well.
You can
if
save
you
the
like.
individual shots if you like. I tend to discard because
It would
otherwise
build up very quickly, wouldn't
very
it?
quickly,
Yes.
yeah. And of course you wear out shutter boxes quite
I
quickly
can
as well, so you
imagine.
have to take that into
Yeah.
account. So you've got quite a lot of latitude with it. So you can leave the camera on the tripod. That will leave things very still, obviously, but you can still move the tripod head in between its exposure. You can set the camera to shoot continuously, or you can set the camera to pause between each shot, so you can do high-speed shooting if you want.
Yeah.
So the reason Canon have built these modes in is for things like, the sort of classic shots of a golfer doing his swing.
Oh, yeah, the multiple
where
golf
where
clubs.
photographers used to have to use a high-speed camera,
Yeah.
shoot a whole load of frames, and then in Photoshop lay each frame on top of each other, painstakingly mask away.
Yeah.
Well, choosing the right blending mode with this, they can now use a 1DX,
Yeah.
fire 7 or 8 frames a second, and get Tiger Woods' swing all in one frame.
Fantastic.
Snowboarders doing somersaults through the sky all on one frame.
So it's not true that they've done it to try and get people to repair the shutters more often?
No,
Okay.
absolutely not.
Just checking.
No, they would never do that. No, absolutely not. Yeah.
So how is this looking different? I mean, have you just been playing around with the lighting, I presume, have you?
Okay, absolutely, yeah. So you'll notice I've taken the filters off,
Yeah.
just to start off with. But if you're going to do sort of ICM as well as multiple exposure, again, it's all about duration of exposure.
Yeah.
So use filters to slow the shutter speed down, just the same. So I've set this now for, let me just check for you. I've set it to, let's go to darks.
Okay.
I've got it on, we'll set it to 4 exposures, and we'll just enable that. And I'll put it on continuous shooting so we can shoot away. So exactly the same process now, just frame the shot. I'm using live view so I can sort of frame, and I'm holding the camera out at arm's length, so there'll be a little bit of movement that just introduces. But I'm not particularly perhaps going to introduce a lot of ICM, and I'll just go 1, 2, 3, and then maybe one blurry one, and I get a shot. And it starts to build up, and I don't know whether you can see that. Does that show up on the camera? I don't know.
No, not.
It doesn't if it's gone off the screen.
And I think we'll introduce it over the layer. And it's interesting how those purples and oranges and greens that you picked out there, they show up a lot stronger on those
Absolutely,
images.
yeah. If I do exactly the same thing, I'm just about to run out of battery power. I've got spare batteries on it. If I do the same thing, but I'll do it with lights.
Yeah. And that's true, there were no white trees there.
They disappeared. And now the tree is much more apparent, and the colours go much softer and brighter. And so, again, it's an experimental process. You will soon get used to looking at a scene and thinking, I'll use, darks for this. And I'll probably make it really intense. I'll go for 8 or 9 frames, or if I just 3 frames, it'll be about the right kind of intensity.
What sort of shutter speeds do you generally use then? I mean, I presume you're trying to use sort of reasonably long, so you can play around with some movement.
I like a little bit of movement,
Yeah.
so if I'm doing ICM with it, then again, I will probably be around the 1 second mark.
Yeah.
Because you're doing several frames, the ICM effect is multiplying as well.
Yeah.
So if you did 5 seconds and 5 frames, it would become very diffuse and very, very abstract.
Yeah, you want the texture in there still, don't you? Because it's about...
So maybe if I'm doing ICM and ME at the same time, maybe I'd experiment around a second, half a second.
Yeah.
Experiment. If I'm trying to keep it quite still, as you can see, I've taken all the filters off, and here I've got, I'm getting, you know, just a quarter of a second or less.
Yeah.
You know, and so
enough to get a little bit of movement in, presumably.
Just a little, and by holding it at arm's length, you get, and then yeah, just point it at something totally different if you want, and you get a completely different effect. So you can just play. It's lovely. I like it.
Fantastic.
And yeah, you've got people like Valda who really are the masters of this kind of photography. They've really, you know, she really has spent a lot of time perfecting the technique.
Now she uses quite long shutter speeds for each exposure, does she? I'm trying to think in a lot of her pictures.
I would think, you know, she varies what she does a lot. She really experiments.
Right.
You know, she's got the right attitude to it. She really does go out and test and experiment day after day after day, and really pushes the boundaries. And that's why she produces such wonderful images, because she really is learning what it does. I think Valda is probably at the cutting edge of multiple exposures, to be honest.
Fantastic.
Because she's putting so much time and effort into it.
Yeah. And it is, presumably, that feedback does start to make you realise what works and what doesn't work, so you can hone in on ideas quicker and become more creative once you've done a lot of it.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah,
definitely.
Wonderful. Well, we'll let you carry on taking a few more pictures.
Yep.
And we'll look forward to the post-processing
Brilliant.
seminar.
Yeah, I look forward to it. It'll be great. Thanks, Tim.